Labor is one of the key factors of production used by firms in the production process. But one thing to notice is that labor is valued not for its own sake, but for the output that it produces. In other words, the fundamental reason for firms to demand labor is for the revenue that can be obtained from selling the output that is produced by using the labor. In short, we say labor is a derived demand, that is, demand which is driven from the demand of the product that labor is producing. Let's consider an example. Let's say there is a firm that is manufacturing cars. Now, the firm hires workers to operate the machinery that is used in the production. However, the firm does not hire a worker just because he or she is a nice person. The firm wants something from the labor. The firm aims, therefore, to maximize profit by selling the car produced, and the worker is needed because the labor services that he or she provides will help them produce the car. The notion of the derived demand is actually underpinning the labor market. And when we look at the demand for labor, we say demand for labor is based on this theory of derived demand, and we call this theory the marginal revenue product theory. When we look at marginal revenue product theory, we say marginal revenue product is simply the change in total revenue resulting from employing one worker holding the quantity of all other factors constant. In other words, keeping everything else constant, like for example, the quantity of capital, the quantity of other inputs, and we just increase one worker, how much will be the change in total revenue that happens because of that? From the labor's perspective, we say that the firm's revenue can be increased through the additional unit of a factor of production like labor in a two-step process. Number one, it increases output. And number two, when you add more labor, this increased output increases the firm's total revenue. In other words, we can say that MRP is equal to the increased output, which is MP, times MR, which is the increased revenue from that unit sold. And if you remember our theory of firm, we also said that in a perfectly competitive market, price is equal to MR, which means I can rewrite my MRP equation as MRP is equal to MP times P. Now let's do a simple example to understand what am I saying when I say MRP. So MRP is the extra revenue that we have from an additional worker, and let's say this additional worker give me 5 units of an output. Let's say this is a cricket bat manufacturing firm, and let's say that the labor that I hired has given me 5 bats, and let's say each bat is sold for $10. Then I can say the MRP in this case will be $50, which is the extra revenue that I get from hiring one extra unit of labor. Let's also see the derivation of MRP through a diagram. So if we draw our diagram, first let's look at simply our price or demand curve. If you look at perfectly competitive market, our demand curve is perfectly elastic. So I can write this is my demand, which is also my price, or MR in a perfectly competitive market. Now this is from a firm's perspective, this is the demand it's facing. Now from a labor perspective, when you hire extra labor, so this is my quantity of labor that I'm hiring, and I'm looking at its MP. The MP curve, if you remember from our production theory, was something like this. So MP curve we said is downward sloping primarily because after some time law of diminishing return will set in and MP will start to fall. Now MRP is simply the product of P times MP, or in other words this graph times this graph is your MRP. So if I look at that and I make my MRP graph, so I'm going to have MRP here, and I'm going to have my quantity of labor because I'm looking at how labor is going to add to my revenue, and simply this times this, because this is a constant value. Let's say in our example this was for $10, so $10 times MP graph, my MRP will be in dollar because this is giving me revenue, and will look something like this. It will have a shape exactly equal to my MP, but the scale will be of course different because this graph will be 10 times more because MP times P is your MRP. So if somebody asks us why is MRP downward sloping in the perfectly competitive market, we can say because MP is downward sloping, and because demand curve is constant, it's a perfectly elastic demand curve. The only reason why MRP is downward sloping is primarily because of the idea that MP is downward sloping. Now, also one need to understand this, that MRP is the demand for labor, and the reason why we call it demand for labor is because this is the benefit that we get from hiring one extra unit of labor. Now another important thing to consider here is this, that what if this was not perfect competition, or what if this was a price setting firm, which means that they have a downward sloping demand curve. So what is different will then be that when you have a downward sloping demand curve, then we know this, that the downward sloping demand curve will have something like this of a diagram. The demand curve is downward sloping like this, and the MR is below the demand curve, something like this. So if this is my demand curve, this is my MR, this is my demand, which is equal to my price or AR. So one could argue this, that if your MRP is equal to MP times MR, then in a case of a price setter, both MR is falling and the MP is falling when the quantity goes up, and that's why MRP will be downward sloping. Let me write this, it will be downward sloping because of both MP to fall and MR to fall. Unlike perfect competition, if I go back, because the MR is constant, only reason why the demand curve is downward sloping for labor, or MRP is downward sloping for labor, is because MP is falling. But in imperfect competition, or a firm which has a downward sloping demand curve, both MP and MR falls, and therefore MRP has two reasons why it is downward sloping. Now let's consider how a firm operating under perfect competition may look at profit maximization. We say the profit maximization in a labor market context happens where MRP is equal to marginal cost, or MC. Now, what is MRP? MRP is simply the additional benefit of hiring one extra worker, while the marginal cost is the extra cost of hiring one extra worker. And we say when the MRP equals to MC, this is where a firm is maximizing its profit from hiring one additional worker. Let's see this concept in terms of a diagram to understand this better. Now, when we look at the cost of hiring one extra worker, it actually is the wage we paid. So in a perfectly competitive market, if we remember from our discussion, when you look at the marginal cost of hiring one extra worker, marginal cost of hiring one extra worker will be the wage that we pay. So let's say if the wage rate is, for example, $5, and we say this, that this is the marginal cost because you can hire one worker, two worker, or whatever the number of workers that you hire. Your cost is $5 per worker plus say per hour. We also need to understand why is this marginal cost curve perfectly elastic. Well, we say in a perfectly competitive market, we are a wage taker rather than wage setter, which means that the firm cannot influence the market wage because it's too small and can obtain as much labor as it wants at the going wage rate. So if the going wage rate is $5, then I can hire one worker per hour, or two worker per hour, or three worker per hour, whatever the number of workers per hour that I want. It could be infinitely large number of workers that I can hire, but I can only hire them at the going wage rate. So the marginal cost is kind of constant and is completely horizontal. Now the marginal revenue of hiring worker, we have drawn that curve that is looking like this. So my MRP is the marginal revenue product, which we say is a demand of labor, is equal to MP times P. So where the equilibrium happens, this is the point where we say MC equals to MRP, and we will hire, let's say, Q dash number of workers. Now, why is this the level of employment where the profit is maximized. When we say this, that this is maximized because when you look at the wage rate $5 and Q dash, anything before Q dash, we can say this: the MRP is greater than your MRP is greater than the marginal cost or the wage rate. In other words, when MRP is greater than the wage rate, then we can argue that the worker is adding more to the revenue than to the cost, and which means that hiring more labor is going to be beneficial because the marginal profit which we get from hiring labor will be positive, so is positive, and because of marginal profit to be positive, the total profit will go up. Remember, the addition to revenue is, for example, 7, while the addition to cost is, for example, 5, then the addition to profit will be 2. So as long as the extra profit is positive, the total profit will go up. But beyond Q dash, what happens is that the extra profit, if you look at this from here onwards, my MRP is actually less than wage rate, which means the labor is adding more to cost than to your revenue, which means that the marginal profit will be negative, and because the marginal profit is negative, your total profit will be pi for profit will be going down. So before Q dash, we can say this, that MRP is greater than W of wage rate or marginal cost, and therefore total profit is going up. After that, Q dash MRP is less than W, total profit is going down, which means when MRP is equal to the wage rate or marginal cost, this is where the total profit will be maximized from hiring our Q dash number of workers. That's why, according to the marginal revenue product theory, whenever MRP is equal to MC or wage rate, this is where the profits are maximized for a firm.